Let me ask you something. When you watch the news, and I mean really watch it, not just let it wash over you, what do you see? You see men in suits, women at podiums, flags, handshakes, summits, war rooms, satellite imagery, carefully worded statements. You see the chessboard, and somewhere in the back of your mind you tell yourself, okay, these people are different from me. They've read the briefs, they've run the models, they've played this game their entire lives. Whatever I think of their politics, at least, the decisions being made up there are rational, calculated, strategic, that the adults are in the room. Let me tell you something. That is the most dangerous assumption you will ever make. You know this scene. You've been in this scene. Two people, both perfectly intelligent, both completely capable of reason, and within 5 minutes, they're somewhere neither of them plan to go, saying things they'll regret, doing things they can't fully explain. In French, we have a word for it. Emballement. It means runaway. The engine that takes over when reason leaves the room, when emotion grabs the wheel and floors it. Emballement. Remember that word. Because here's what nobody in the media will say out loud. What just happened in that kitchen? That emballement? That moment where reason packed its bags and left? It happens in war rooms. It happens in presidential palaces. It happens at nuclear negotiating tables. And the scary part, the part that should genuinely keep you up at night, is that the science backs this up completely, and the science has a name for it. Neuroscientists call it amygdala hijack. The moment your oldest, most primal brain region, the one you share with lizards and crocodiles, takes over from your prefrontal cortex, your rational brain, it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't check your calendar. It doesn't care that you're the leader of the free world or the chairman of the most powerful nation on earth. It fires. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The trigger isn't danger. The trigger isn't even fear. The trigger is humiliation. There's a concept in Japanese, sekimen, literally, red face, the shame of being seen to have lost. The Japanese have built entire social architectures around avoiding it. But you don't need to speak Japanese to understand sekimen. You felt it the last time someone embarrassed you in front of people who mattered. Your face went hot, something shifted, and suddenly, you weren't thinking clearly anymore. Now, imagine that feeling. But the audience isn't your friends or your colleagues. The audience is 7 billion people, and they're watching live. Here's what changed. And this is the thing historians will write about. The thing that makes our moment in history genuinely different from every empire that came before. In ancient Rome, when a general lost a battle to a Germanic tribe, a vassal tribe, smaller, supposedly weaker, news traveled by horse. It took weeks, months. The humiliation was real, but it was private for long enough that cooler heads could manage it. The emperor could spin it. The Senate could contain it. Today? Let me explain what today looks like. A superpower stumbles in a strait nobody can pronounce. And before the press secretary has even drafted the response, the markets have already felt it. Bond yields move. Currency futures shift. Satellites are repositioned. The Germans have a word for it, Schadenfreude. The particular pleasure taken from watching someone powerful fall. Your rivals feel it instantly. Your allies feel it instantly. Your own people feel it. Before you've had a chance to tell them what to feel. In ancient times, losing face before your vassals was a slow, manageable wound. Today, it is instantaneous and global. And when the most powerful military force in human history is seen, live, on every screen in the world, unable to reopen a strait it promised to control, that's not a strategic problem. That's a sekimen moment. And sekimen, at that scale, is where wars start. We are not here today to talk about politics. We are not here to take sides. We are here to do something far more unsettling. We are going to pull back the curtain on the machinery of world power and show you that behind the suits, the flags, the press conferences and the war rooms, the engine running the whole show is not a supercomputer. It's the same engine running the argument in that kitchen. Emballement, fear, shame, ego. The desperate human need to not be seen as weak. And right now, that engine is running very, very hot. My name is Arthur Sterling. This is Sterling Intel, where we go deeper than the headline, further than the pundit class, into the geopolitical, financial, and psychological forces that actually shape your world. If that's what you've been looking for, subscribe. Now let's get into it. Chapter 1. The science nobody told you about. Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you about a field of research that has existed for over 50 years, peer-reviewed, academically rigorous, published in the most respected journals on Earth, and almost completely ignored by the people who report the news. It's called political psychology. And what it has found, consistently, repeatedly, across decades of research, should have changed the way we talk about world events entirely. It didn't. And that silence is itself worth thinking about. Let me tell you where this field was born. The year is 1943. The United States government has a problem. A man named Adolf Hitler is making decisions that no rational actor model can explain. His generals are telling him one thing, his intelligence services are telling him another, and he keeps doing something else entirely. Something that looks, from the outside, less like strategy and more like compulsion. So the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, does something unprecedented. They hire a psychoanalyst, a man named Walter Langer, and they give him one assignment: figure out what is wrong with this man. Not militarily, not politically, psychologically. Langer's report, delivered in 1943, classified for decades, was the first formal psychological profile of a sitting world leader in history. And what it found was not a criminal mastermind, not a cold strategic genius. What it found was a man being driven, almost entirely, by primal emotional forces: shame, humiliation, the desperate need for historical vindication, a wounded ego operating at civilizational scale. Sound familiar? That report planted a seed. And over the following decades, a quiet community of researchers began asking a question that the political science mainstream didn't want to touch. What if leaders aren't rational actors at all? What if the models we use to predict their behavior, the game theory, the cost-benefit frameworks, the strategic interest calculations, are all built on a foundation that was wrong from the start? What if we have been trying to understand a chess game by studying the board, when the real action was always happening in the mind of the player? One man took this question further than almost anyone else, and he did it from a place nobody expected. His name is David Owen, Baron David Owen, British Foreign Secretary under James Callaghan in the 1970s, a man who sat across negotiating tables from some of the most powerful leaders of the 20th century, and also, crucially, a trained medical doctor and neurologist. He had a front row seat, and he had the clinical vocabulary to describe what he was watching. What he saw disturbed him enough that he spent years documenting it, and in 2007 he published his findings under a name that should have made front pages everywhere. He called it Hubris syndrome. Now, hubris is a word we throw around loosely. Arrogance, overconfidence. We use it about celebrities, about CEOs, about athletes who celebrate too early. Owen was not talking about arrogance. He was talking about a clinically observable pattern of behavioral change, documented, repeatable, predictable, that occurs specifically in leaders who hold significant power for an extended period of time. Let me give you the symptoms, because you're going to recognize every single one. A messianic sense of personal destiny. The leader begins to believe that history has chosen them specifically, that their judgment is not just good, it is uniquely correct, that to question them is to question fate itself, a contempt for the counsel of others. Advisors are tolerated, not heard. Information that contradicts the leader's existing worldview is dismissed, reframed, or simply not passed upward, because the people passing it upward have learned what happens when they do. An excessive confidence in personal judgment to the point of recklessness. Decisions that should take weeks are made in hours. Risks that any outside observer can see are ignored, because the leader has stopped being able to see them. And most dangerously, a progressive loss of contact with reality. Not madness in the clinical sense, something more insidious, a gradual drift, a slow decoupling of the leader's internal model of the world from the world itself. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Owen's research found that hubris syndrome is not a personality type. It is not something these leaders arrived with. It is something that power did to them. The office creates the condition. And here is the truly unsettling corollary. The more unchecked the power, the more absolute the authority, the more insulated from consequence, the faster the syndrome develops, and the more severe it becomes. There is even neuroscientific support for this now. Dacher Keltner at UC Berkeley has spent decades studying what he calls the power paradox. His research found that the very behaviors that help people acquire power, empathy, cooperation, the ability to read a room, are systematically degraded by the experience of holding it. Power, Keltner found, essentially produces the same cognitive and behavioral changes as a traumatic brain injury to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, the rational brain, the part that was supposed to be in charge, damaged by power itself. So let me ask you the question this research forces us to ask. When you watch a world leader make a decision that seems incomprehensible, that defies every rational model, that ignores every expert warning, that seems to be driven by something other than strategy, what if it isn't incomprehensible at all? What if it is completely predictable, once you know what you're looking at? What if the science has been telling us exactly what to expect for 50 years, and we just weren't listening? Political psychology didn't stay in the classified files of intelligence agencies. It grew, it developed. It produced researchers like Gerald Post, the man who built the CIA's Center for the Analysis of Personality and Political Behavior, and spent 30 years profiling world leaders for American presidents. It produced the field of leader personality assessment. It produced the concept of operational code analysis, the systematic study of how a leader's deepest psychological assumptions shape their strategic decisions. And across all of it, across 50 years of research, hundreds of case studies, thousands of pages of peer-reviewed findings, one pattern kept emerging. The higher the stakes, the more public the arena, the more the leader's personal sense of status and legacy is on the line, the less rational the decision-making becomes. Not more, less. The suits don't protect us from this. The briefing rooms don't protect us from this. The protocols and the institutions and the carefully worded statements don't protect us from this. If anything, and this is the conclusion the research keeps arriving at, quietly, in journals nobody reads on Sunday morning, they make it worse. But understanding that power corrupts the rational mind is only half the picture, because there is a specific trigger, one particular emotional experience, that takes a leader already running on hubris and turns them into something genuinely dangerous. We talked about it in the introduction. We gave it its Japanese name, sekimen. Now it's time to understand exactly how it works and why the most ordinary human experiences you've ever had are the best preparation for understanding it. That's chapter 2. Let me show you something. Every geopolitical crisis you have ever watched unfold on the news, every war, every sanctions battle, every nuclear standoff, has a smaller version. A version you have already lived through, probably more than once. You just didn't recognize it at the time. Here is what political psychology keeps finding, and what makes it so unsettling once you see it. The dynamics that drive conflict between nations are not categorically different from the dynamics that drive conflict between people. They are the same dynamics, operating at different scales, same software, bigger hardware. The neuroscience confirms this. When a head of state feels their nation has been humiliated on the world stage, the same brain regions activate as when you feel humiliated at a dinner table. The amygdala doesn't know the difference between a slight at a summit and a slight at a family gathering. It just fires. So let me show you how this works. Because for the rest of this video, every time we zoom out to the world stage, I want you to remember the smaller version first, the one you already understand intuitively. Think about a workplace, any workplace. There is always one person who's been there the longest, who knows the most, who built something from nothing, and who, over time, has stopped listening to anyone else. Not because they became stupid, but because success taught them that their instincts were right. And being right, repeatedly, is the most dangerous education a person can receive. In Swahili, they call it kupanda ngazi, climbing the ladder. The higher you climb, the thinner the air. And thin air does something to judgment that nobody warns you about. Now zoom out. That same person does that same psychology. Now imagine them with a military, with a nuclear arsenal, with advisors who have learned that disagreeing with them is career suicide. The dynamic is identical. The consequences are not. This is what makes political psychology so valuable and so ignored simultaneously. It tells us something we don't want to hear. That the people making the decisions that shape your life, the decisions about war and peace, about economic sanctions, about climate agreements, are running on the same emotional operating system as the difficult colleague in your office. The same one as the stubborn relative at your dinner table. Let me give you 3 everyday mirrors. 3 situations you already understand, that map directly onto how world leaders behave when the pressure is on. Mirror 1. The apology that never comes. You have been in a situation, at work, in a relationship, in a family, where someone in a position of authority made a mistake. A clear, obvious, undeniable mistake. And instead of acknowledging it, they doubled down. They reframed it. They found someone else to blame. Because admitting the mistake meant admitting they were fallible, and that was a price their ego could not pay. At the dinner table, this is frustrating. At the Security Council, this is how wars get extended by years after the rational exit point has passed. Mirror 2. The threat that has to be followed through. Someone in your life, a parent, a boss, a partner, has made a threat in the heat of the moment, and then found themselves trapped by it. Because backing down meant losing face, especially in front of an audience. In Japanese, men wo tamotsu, keeping face, the desperate structural need to be seen as someone whose word means something. Leaders feel this at a magnitude that makes personal ego look trivial, because their audience isn't just the room, it's history itself. Mirror 3, the silence that says everything. In any relationship, personal or professional, there are moments where communication breaks down entirely, where both sides stop talking and start signaling, where every action becomes a message and every inaction becomes a threat. Diplomats call this brinkmanship, standing at the edge of the cliff together and waiting to see who blinks first. But strip away the diplomatic language and what you have is 2 people in a standoff. Each one too proud to step back. Each one terrified that stepping back means losing everything. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath all 3 mirrors. The behaviors that create the most dangerous moments in world history, the doubling down, the face-saving escalation, the refusal to communicate, are not the behaviors of monsters. They are the behaviors of ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. People like you, people like me, people who, in a different context, at a smaller scale with lower stakes, you would recognize immediately, because you have seen them before, in your office, in your family, in yourself. The mirror is uncomfortable precisely because it is accurate. And this brings us to the specific moment, the specific psychological trigger, where ordinary human behavior becomes genuinely catastrophic at scale. We have named it, we have felt it. Now we need to understand exactly what happens inside it. The difference between private shame and public humiliation. And why that difference, that single variable, may be the most dangerous force in the world right now. That's chapter 3. Let me ask you something personal. Think of the most embarrassing thing that has ever happened to you. Something you did wrong. A mistake you made. A moment where you fell short of who you thought you were. Now, did anyone see it? Because that answer changes everything. Psychology has known for decades that there are 2 fundamentally different emotional experiences that look identical from the outside but feel completely different from the inside. The first is shame, private shame, the feeling you carry alone when you know you have failed. It is painful, it is heavy, but it is contained. It stays inside. And because it stays inside, it can be processed. You can sit with it, you can learn from it, you can quietly correct course without anyone knowing the old course existed. The second is humiliation, public humiliation. The same failure, but witnessed, seen, acknowledged by others. And here is where everything changes. When an audience is present, the psychology transforms completely. The internal experience of failure becomes an external event, and the brain stops processing it as a mistake to learn from, and starts processing it as a threat to survive. Let me show you this in the most ordinary setting possible. A married couple. They have a disagreement. At home, alone, behind closed doors. Maybe one of them said something wrong. Maybe a decision was made that hurt the other. In private, these things get resolved. Not always easily, not always quickly, but they get resolved because both people can afford to back down. Both people can afford to admit fault. There is no audience keeping score. Now take that exact same disagreement. Same couple, same words, same mistake, but now they are at a dinner party. Friends are watching. Family is present. The audience has arrived. Watch what happens. The person who was wrong, who in private might have apologized within the hour, now cannot back down. Not because they stopped knowing they were wrong, but because backing down in public means something entirely different from backing down in private. It means losing. It means being seen to lose. And the primitive part of the brain, the part that has been running human social dynamics since before language existed, that part cannot tolerate being seen to lose. In Yoruba, there is a saying, Oju lo inje omo eniyan. It means, it is the eyes of others that consume a person. The gaze of the crowd is not neutral. It is a force. It changes behavior. It changes decisions. It changes outcomes. Now zoom out. Take everything I just described, the couple, the dinner party, the audience that makes backing down impossible, and scale it up. The couple becomes two nations. The dinner party becomes the United Nations Security Council. The friends watching become 2 billion people with smartphones and live feeds and instant reactions. And the mistake, the wrong decision, the failed policy, the military overreach that didn't achieve its objectives, that mistake is now on every screen on Earth simultaneously. Here is the question that should terrify you. In that moment, when the most powerful leader in the world is seen to have failed, publicly, globally, in real time, what does their brain tell them to do? Not their advisors, not their strategic models, not the rational cost-benefit analysis their team prepared. Their brain. It tells them the same thing it told the husband at the dinner party. The same thing it has told every humiliated primate since the beginning of social hierarchies. Do not back down. Whatever the cost, do not be seen to lose. Political psychologists have a term for this. They call it audience costs. The political price a leader pays when they back down from a public commitment in front of a watching audience. The research is unambiguous. Democratic leaders who back down publicly face electoral punishment. Their own supporters abandon them. The opposition brands them as weak. The media frames every subsequent decision through the lens of that retreat. Autocratic leaders face something even more dangerous. When an autocrat is seen to back down publicly, the signal it sends to potential rivals inside their own system is existential. In an authoritarian structure, perceived weakness is an invitation that has historically ended careers, and sometimes lives. So both the Democrat and the autocrat, for completely different structural reasons, arrive at the same place. The audience makes backing down functionally impossible, not because they are irrational, but because the rational calculation, when audience costs are included, often points toward escalation. And here is the truly modern dimension of this problem, the one that has no historical precedent. For most of human history, the audience was local, a tribe, a village, a court, a nation. The humiliation of a leader was witnessed by hundreds, maybe thousands, and it traveled slowly. A lost battle took weeks to become known. A failed negotiation took months to filter through the public consciousness. That lag time was a safety valve. It gave rational actors room to maneuver, room to reframe, room to manage the narrative before the emotional response locked in. Today, that safety valve is gone. A military setback at dawn is a trending topic by breakfast. A failed ultimatum in a closed room leaks to 5 journalists before the principals have left the building. A leader's moment of weakness, a stumble, a contradiction, a retreat, is clipped, captioned, and shared across 7 billion devices before their communications team has drafted the official response. The audience is now permanent, it is global, and it has zero tolerance for ambiguity. This is the world we are living in right now. And it is genuinely unprecedented in human history. We have nuclear-armed powers operating in a real-time global panopticon, where every move is seen, every weakness is amplified, and the audience cost of backing down has never been higher. Think about what that means for the psychology of the people at the top. They are operating under a level of performative pressure that no previous generation of leaders has ever faced. Every decision is simultaneously a strategic calculation and a performance for an audience of billions. And when those two things conflict, when the strategic calculation says back down but the audience says you cannot, which one wins? History gives us a very consistent answer. The audience wins, almost every time. Private shame can be survived. It can even be transformative. The greatest growth in any human life often comes from private moments of reckoning with failure. But public humiliation, especially at the scale we are talking about, triggers something different. Something older. Something that reason cannot easily override. And when that something takes hold of a person who controls armies, who controls nuclear codes, who controls the financial systems that your savings and your pension and your mortgage depend on, that is when the kitchen argument becomes a war. That is when the dinner party standoff becomes a sanctions regime that collapses an economy. That is when the gap between what is rational and what actually happens becomes the most dangerous space in the world. That's chapter 4. There is a moment in the life of every powerful leader where something shifts. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up on any brain scan or blood test. But the people around them notice it. The advisors who used to be heard suddenly aren't. The decisions that used to take weeks start taking hours. The leader who once asked questions starts giving answers before the questions are finished. Something has changed, and what has changed is not their intelligence, not their experience, not their commitment. What has changed is their brain. In 2007, a British neurologist and former Foreign Secretary named David Owen published a clinical study that should have changed the way the world thinks about political leadership forever. He called it Hubris syndrome. And unlike most political commentary, this was not opinion. This was clinical observation. Owen had spent decades sitting across tables from heads of state. He had watched the transformation happen in real time. And as a trained neurologist, he had the vocabulary to describe what he was seeing. What he found was a pattern, consistent, repeatable, cross-cultural, a cluster of behaviors that emerged specifically in leaders who held significant power for extended periods. Not all leaders, but enough to constitute a syndrome, enough to warrant a clinical name. Let me walk you through the 14 symptoms Owen identified, because you are going to recognize every single one. Not from textbooks, from the news. 1. A narcissistic propensity to see the world primarily as an arena in which to exercise power and seek glory. 2. A predisposition to take actions that seem likely to cast the leader in a good light, regardless of whether those actions are good policy. 3. A disproportionate concern with image and presentation. 4. A messianic manner of talking about what they are doing and an exaltation in the scope of their activities. 5. An identification of themselves with the state or organization to the point where they believe their interests and the state's interests are identical. 6. A tendency to speak in the third person or use the royal we. 7. Excessive confidence in their own judgment and a contempt for the advice or criticism of others. 8. An exaggerated belief that they will be vindicated by history or God. 9. And restlessness, recklessness, and impulsiveness. 10. A loss of contact with reality, often associated with progressive isolation. You have seen this list before. You just didn't know it had a clinical name. Now here is the part that Owen considered most significant, and the part that most people miss when they discuss this research. These symptoms are not personality traits that predisposed certain people to seek power. They are not character flaws that filtered upward through political systems selecting for narcissists. They are acquired. They develop after the leader takes power. They are caused by the experience of holding power itself. Owen documented this progression carefully. Early in their tenure, most of the leaders he studied showed none of these symptoms. They were curious. They listened. They sought counsel. They doubted themselves appropriately. Then power accumulated. Time passed. Success compounded, and the symptoms began to emerge, slowly at first, then faster, like a feedback loop that accelerates once it begins. The office doesn't attract the corrupt. The office corrupts. That is the distinction that changes everything. The neuroscience behind this is now well documented. Dacher Keltner at UC Berkeley spent decades researching what happens to the brain under conditions of sustained power. His findings, published across multiple peer-reviewed studies, point to a consistent neurological pattern. Power activates the brain's reward circuitry in ways similar to certain controlled substances. The experience of being deferred to, of having your decisions implemented, your preferences accommodated, your presence treated as significant, produces measurable dopamine responses. The brain begins to associate the exercise of power with reward, and like any reward system, it begins to seek more, simultaneously. And this is the critical finding. Sustained power degrades the neural pathways associated with empathy and perspective taking, the ability to model other people's mental states, to feel what they feel, to see what they see. In plain language, power makes you progressively less capable of understanding the people you are governing, not because you become evil, because your brain literally changes. There is a Japanese concept that captures this perfectly, kanson minpi. It translates literally as revere the official, despise the people. It describes a cultural and psychological tendency, observed across many societies, not just Japan, where those in positions of authority gradually come to see themselves as categorically different from and superior to those they govern. Kansen Minpi is not a policy. It is not an ideology. It is a neurological drift, a slow psychological migration away from the common experience of being human, towards something more isolated, more self-referential, more dangerous, and it happens to almost everyone who holds power long enough. Across cultures, across centuries, across ideological lines. Let me give you the case that Owen considers the clearest modern example of hubris syndrome in its most developed form. Tony Blair, British Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007, one of the most gifted political communicators of his generation. When he entered office, he was curious, consultative, genuinely interested in the counsel of others. His early domestic policies were carefully constructed and broadly popular. But Owen, who knew Blair personally, documents a progressive transformation over the course of his tenure. By the time of the Iraq War decision in 2003, Blair was exhibiting multiple advanced hubris syndrome markers simultaneously: the messianic certainty, the contempt for dissenting intelligence assessments, the identification of his personal moral conviction with state policy, the belief that history would vindicate him regardless of what the evidence said. The result? A decision that cost hundreds of thousands of lives, destabilized an entire region, and destroyed Blair's own legacy. Owen's point is not that Blair was evil. His point is that Blair was predictable. The syndrome had been developing for years. The symptoms were visible to anyone who knew what to look for. And nobody, not his cabinet, not his party, not the institutional safeguards of British democracy, was looking. This is the institutional failure that concerns Owen most. Not that leaders develop hubris syndrome, but that the systems designed to check power consistently fail to recognize it until the damage is done. Cabinets become yes rooms. Advisors learn what happens when they disagree. Opposition becomes marginalized. The media cycle rewards confidence and punishes doubt. And the leader, increasingly isolated inside a feedback loop of deference and validation, loses the one thing that kept their judgment calibrated: contact with reality. And here is where hubris syndrome becomes truly dangerous. Not when the leader is merely overconfident, but when they encounter the one experience that the hubristic mind cannot process rationally: public failure, public humiliation, the moment when the world sees that the emperor has no clothes. Because a normal person, embarrassed publicly, feels shame and adjusts, but a leader deep in hubris syndrome, publicly humiliated, cannot adjust. The syndrome has removed that capacity. What remains is only the primal response, the one we discussed in chapter 3. Do not back down, whatever the cost. Escalate. That's chapter 5. Everything we have covered so far, the amygdala hijack, the public humiliation trigger, the hubris syndrome progression, exists in the realm of theory, clinical observation, academic research. Now we test it against history. Because if political psychology is correct, if these patterns are real, repeatable, and predictable, then we should be able to find them operating in the historical record, clearly, consistently, across different cultures, different centuries, different political systems. And we can. 3 leaders, 3 civilizations, 3 moments where the pattern played out with almost identical structure, and 3 catastrophes that followed with almost identical logic. Case File 1, Nero, Rome, 54 to 68 AD. Let me tell you who Nero was before power consumed him. He was 17 years old when he became Emperor of Rome. 17. By most accounts of his early reign, the first 5 years, he was considered a reasonable ruler. He reduced taxes. He banned capital punishment. He showed genuine interest in arts and culture. His advisor Seneca, one of the greatest philosophical minds of the ancient world, guided his decisions with considerable wisdom. The hubris syndrome symptoms were not present. Not yet. Then something shifted. It always does. Nero had his mother Agrippina murdered. Then his first wife Octavia. Then Seneca, his last remaining check on reality, was forced to commit suicide. Each removal was justified at the time. Each one seemed rational in isolation. But together, they represent a systematic elimination of every voice that might contradict him. By the time Rome burned in 64 AD, whether Nero started the fire or merely failed to stop it, the psychological damage was complete. A man who had begun his reign with genuine promise was now publicly blaming Christians for a disaster his own negligence had enabled, hosting elaborate performances in his private gardens while Romans died, building the Domus Aurea, his golden palace, on the rubble of people's homes. The pattern: isolation, elimination of counsel, reality distortion, public catastrophe, scapegoating, is textbook hubris syndrome, 1400 years before David Owen had a name for it. Case File 2, Napoleon Bonaparte, France, 1799 to 1815. Napoleon is perhaps the most studied case of hubris syndrome in history, which makes it remarkable that so few people apply that lens explicitly to his decisions. The early Napoleon, the Corsican artillery officer who rose through merit, who won battles through tactical genius, who modernized French law and administration, showed virtually none of the syndrome's markers. He was intensely curious. He read voraciously. He surrounded himself with the best minds in Europe and genuinely listened to them. Then came the coronation, 1804. And something in the psychological architecture changed. Here is the detail that Owen considers most revealing. At his coronation, Napoleon took the crown from Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. The Pope had traveled from Rome specifically to crown him. Napoleon couldn't wait, couldn't allow even the symbolic act of receiving power from another. Had to demonstrate, publicly, theatrically, irreversibly, that his authority came from himself alone. That gesture, that single moment of public self-coronation, is hubris syndrome made physical. What followed is well documented. The Russian campaign of 1812 launched against the advice of virtually every competent military mind around him. 600,000 soldiers entered Russia, 100,000 returned. Napoleon had been warned. He had been shown the supply line mathematics. He had been told what Russian winters did to invading armies. He knew better. He always knew better now. In French, there is a phrase, l'orgueil précède la chute. Pride precedes the fall. The French understood this pattern long before the clinical vocabulary existed to describe it. Case File 3, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany, 1888 to 1918. This case is the most directly relevant to the world we are living in right now, because Wilhelm's descent into hubris syndrome didn't produce a domestic catastrophe, it produced a world war. Wilhelm came to power at 29 with the most powerful military machine in Europe at his disposal. He was educated, multilingual, genuinely intelligent. His first act as Kaiser was to dismiss Otto von Bismarck, the architect of modern Germany, the man who had kept European peace through a delicate network of alliances for decades, because Wilhelm felt constrained by him. Bismarck's departure is the critical moment. The last real check on Wilhelm's judgment was gone, and the syndrome accelerated. Wilhelm became increasingly erratic. His diplomatic communications were impulsive and contradictory. He made personal promises to foreign leaders that his own government hadn't authorized. He gave interviews to foreign newspapers that embarrassed Germany internationally and had to be walked back by his own cabinet. But the pivotal moment, the one that connects directly to everything we have discussed about public humiliation, was the Agadir crisis of 1911. Germany sent a gunboat to Morocco, the SMS Panther, in a show of force designed to challenge French colonial expansion. It was supposed to be a demonstration of German power. Instead, Britain backed France. Germany was forced to back down, publicly, visibly, in front of every European power watching. The humiliation was complete, and the German nationalist press, which Wilhelm read obsessively, amplified every dimension of it. Germany had been seen to blink. Germany had been seen to lose face. 3 years later, World War I began. Historians debate the causes endlessly: the alliance systems, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the mobilization timetables. But running underneath all of it, visible to anyone applying a political psychology lens, is the unprocessed humiliation of Agadir. The audience had seen Germany back down, and the audience cost of backing down again was politically impossible. 3 case files, 3 different centuries, 3 different cultures, 3 different political systems. One pattern: a leader begins with genuine ability, power accumulates, the checks on judgment are systematically removed, hubris syndrome develops, a public humiliation occurs. The audience cost of backing down becomes politically impossible, escalation follows, catastrophe results. The OSS psychologist Gerald Post, who spent 30 years profiling world leaders for American presidents, described this pattern as the most consistent finding in the entire field of political psychology. Not that all leaders are dangerous, but that the combination of hubris syndrome plus public humiliation plus audience pressure creates a specific and predictable risk profile that has preceded virtually every major political catastrophe in recorded history. Now, I want you to hold that pattern in your mind, the progression, the trigger, the catastrophic outcome, and I want you to ask yourself one question. In the world right now, which leaders show the most advanced markers of hubris syndrome? Which ones have been most publicly humiliated in recent years? Which ones face the highest audience costs for backing down? I am not going to answer that question for you, that would be editorializing. And Sterling Intel does not editorialize, but I will tell you this: the pattern is not ancient history. It is not safely contained in the past. It is operating right now, in real time, on screens you have access to. And the markets, which, as we discussed earlier, are the most honest emotional seismograph we have, the markets can feel it. They always feel it before the analysts admit it. 3 leaders, 3 patterns, 3 catastrophes. But here is the question that history has never been able to answer satisfactorily. If the pattern is so consistent, if it has played out the same way across centuries and civilizations, why do the markets, the institutions, the cabinets, the democratic systems, the international bodies, why does nobody stop it? Why does the audience that creates the pressure never seem to understand what the pressure produces? That is the question Chapter 6 answers. That's Chapter 6. Before a single shot is fired, before a single sanction is announced, before the press secretary walks to the podium and reads the carefully worded statement that nobody believes anyway, the markets have already moved. This is not a coincidence. This is not insider trading. This is not some conspiracy of Goldman Sachs bankers with satellite phones and secret handshakes. This is something far more interesting and far more useful, if you know how to read it. Financial markets are, at their core, a real-time aggregation of human judgment. Every trade that happens represents someone making a decision based on what they believe is true about the world right now and what they believe will be true about the world tomorrow. Millions of those decisions, happening simultaneously, globally, continuously, produce a signal. Not a perfect signal, not an infallible one, but an honest one. Because unlike politicians, unlike state media, unlike official spokespeople, the market has no incentive to lie. It only has an incentive to be right. And what the market has learned over centuries of pricing wars, revolutions, assassinations, coups, and collapses is how to read the emotional state of the people making the decisions that move history. There is a specific instrument that makes this visible. You may have heard of it, the VIX. The VIX, the CBOE Volatility Index, is formally known as the fear gauge. It measures the market's expectation of volatility over the next 30 days. When the VIX rises, it means traders are buying insurance against uncertainty, against the unknown, against the thing they can feel coming but cannot yet name. Watch the VYX during geopolitical crises, and you see something remarkable. It moves before the official narrative catches up. It spiked before the Gulf War ground offensive began. It spiked before the Cuban Missile Crisis became public knowledge. It spiked in the days before the 2008 financial collapse, when every official statement was still saying the fundamentals were sound. The market felt it. Before the press release, before the announcement, before the admission. In Korean, there is a concept, nunchi. It translates roughly as the ability to read the room, to sense what is happening beneath the surface of what is being said, to feel the emotional temperature of a situation before anyone has articulated it. The market has nunchi at civilizational scale. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. When a dominant power begins to show the markers of hubris syndrome, the messianic certainty, the dismissal of counsel, the reality distortion, the market registers it. Not because traders are political psychologists, but because hubris syndrome produces observable behavioral patterns that translate directly into economic risk. Erratic policy announcements, diplomatic relationships that suddenly deteriorate without clear reason, military posturing that seems disproportionate to the stated objective, trade decisions that contradict the country's own economic interests. Each of these is a data point, and the market aggregates data points the way a seismograph aggregates tremors. Not every tremor is an earthquake, but a seismograph that is consistently showing elevated readings, that is telling you something about what is happening beneath the surface. And when a leader is publicly humiliated, when the Sekimen moment arrives, watch what happens to the relevant currency. Watch what happens to the bond market of the humiliated nation. Watch what happens to defense sector stocks, to oil futures, to safe haven assets like gold. They move before the response, because the market has already calculated what a cornered leader is likely to do next. This is why financial literacy is not just about money. It is about understanding the world. A person who can read a bond yield curve has access to information about global risk that no newspaper can provide. A person who understands what currency flight means, when a nation's own wealthy citizens start moving their money out, is reading the most honest referendum on a government's credibility that exists. Because you can fake an election, you can fake a poll, you can fake a press conference, you cannot fake a capital outflow. When money moves, it is telling you something true, and it is almost always telling you something true before the official story catches up with reality. There is one more dimension to this that connects directly to everything we have discussed about public humiliation and audience costs. When a market registers a leader's humiliation, when the currency falls, when the bonds sell off, when the fear gauge spikes, that market reaction itself becomes part of the audience. It becomes another form of public witness to the failure. And for a leader already in the grip of hubris syndrome, already unable to tolerate being seen to lose, watching their currency collapse in real time, watching their nation's creditworthiness being visibly downgraded by the global financial system, that is a humiliation that compounds every other humiliation. The market doesn't just predict the response. The market's reaction becomes part of what the leader is responding to. It adds another layer of audience, another layer of pressure, another reason why backing down becomes psychologically impossible. So the next time you see a market move that seems disconnected from any obvious news event, pause. Ask yourself what the market might be feeling that hasn't been said yet, what emotional reality it might be pricing in that the official narrative is still managing. Because in the gap between what markets feel and what governments admit, that is where the most important story is always being told. And right now, that gap is very wide. That's chapter 7. Let me take you back to the year 1415, the Battle of Agincourt. English forces under Henry V have just defeated a French army 5 times their size. It is one of the most humiliating military defeats in French history. Thousands of French nobles, the flower of French chivalry, dead in a muddy field in northern France. Now, how long did it take for that humiliation to reach Paris? Days, weeks. The news travelled by horse, by messenger, by rumour passed from village to village. By the time the French court fully understood the scale of the defeat, the emotional moment of maximum danger had already begun to pass. There was time to manage the narrative, time to prepare a response, time for reason to re-enter the room. That lag time was not a weakness of medieval communication. It was, without anyone designing it this way, a safety valve. Now let me take you to the present. A military setback happens at 6 a.m. local time. By 6:07, it is on Twitter. By 6:15, it has been picked up by 3 major wire services. By 6:30, it is the top trending topic in 17 countries. By 7 a.m., the leader's own citizens are watching foreign analysis of their nation's failure on their phones over breakfast. The lag time is gone. What once took weeks to become a crisis now takes minutes. What once gave rational actors room to maneuver now gives them none. The window between the humiliating event and the moment when the leader must respond, publicly, visibly, in real time, has collapsed from weeks to hours. And in that collapsed window, hubris syndrome does its most dangerous work. To understand why this matters so much, we need to go back to the neuroscience. When the amygdala hijack occurs, when the primal shame rage response fires, the prefrontal cortex does not immediately go offline. There is a window, a brief period during which the rational brain can still intervene, can still say, wait, think, consider the consequences. Psychologists call this the refractory period, the time between the emotional trigger and the behavioral response during which reflection is still possible. In most human conflicts, even serious ones, this refractory period is long enough for intervention. A marriage counselor, a trusted advisor, a night's sleep. Something that creates enough distance between the trigger and the response for reason to reassert itself. In the modern geopolitical environment, that refractory period has been systematically eliminated. The trigger happens publicly. The response is demanded publicly, immediately, by the media, by the opposition, by the leader's own supporters who are watching and waiting to see if their champion will fight back. There is no night's sleep. There is no marriage counselor. There is only the camera and the expectation of a response. The Arabic concept of wajh, face, operates in a very specific way in political culture across the Middle East and much of the world. Wajh is not simply personal pride. It is a social contract. A leader's face, their public honor, is held in trust by their people. When it is damaged, publicly, visibly, the people feel the damage too. They have lost something, and they expect it to be restored. This creates a social pressure that operates completely independently of whatever the rational strategic calculation says. The leader may know that the rational response is de-escalation. Their advisors may be saying de-escalate. The economic data may be screaming de-escalate. But the street is watching. The cameras are rolling. The social media feeds are filling with their people's humiliation and rage. And watch, the social contract of public honor demands a response that the rational mind knows is dangerous. This is not unique to any culture. It is universal. What changes between cultures is the vocabulary and the ritual through which face is demanded and restored. What doesn't change is the underlying mechanism. Let me give you the historical comparison that makes this concrete. In 1956, the Suez Crisis, Britain and France launched a military operation to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt's Nasser. The United States, under Eisenhower, refused to support them, effectively forced them to withdraw. It was a humiliation of the First Order for Britain. The end of any pretense of British imperial power. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who showed multiple advanced hubris syndrome markers throughout the crisis, had his Waj destroyed publicly and globally. But here is what is critical for our argument. Even in 1956, the news cycle was slow enough that the humiliation, while severe, was manageable. It took days for the full picture to emerge. Eden was able to resign quietly. Britain was able to recalibrate its foreign policy position over months rather than hours. Now ask yourself, what would the Suez Crisis have looked like with smartphones, with live footage, with 17 million people watching the British retreat on TikTok in real time? Would Eden have been able to withdraw quietly? Or would the speed of the audience's reaction have forced a different, more dangerous response? This is the world every current leader operates in, and it has created a structural bias toward escalation that has no historical precedent. Because here is the cruel mathematics of modern geopolitics. The speed of information has made humiliation more public than ever before, more immediate, more undeniable, more impossible to spin or manage or delay. But the speed of escalation, the actual military and economic machinery of response, has not slowed down to match. If anything, it has accelerated. Precision weapons, instantaneous financial sanctions, cyber attacks that can happen in milliseconds. So we have created a world where the emotional trigger is faster than ever, the audience pressure is larger than ever, and the tools of response are more powerful and more immediate than ever. And the refractory period, the window for reason to intervene, has never been smaller. The safety valve that protected empires from their own worst impulses for centuries, the simple gift of time between the wound and the response, has been eliminated by the thing we built to connect us. We did not design this. We did not choose it. It emerged from 1,000 individual decisions, each one reasonable, each one beneficial in isolation, that together produced a world where shame travels at the speed of light and reason travels at the speed of bureaucracy. And somewhere in that gap, between the speed of shame and the speed of wisdom, is where the most dangerous decisions in human history get made. That's chapter 8. Every empire believes it is different. Every empire looks at the ruins of the ones that came before and finds reasons why its own story will end differently. Rome fell because of barbarians. The Ottoman Empire fell because of nationalist movements. The British Empire fell because of economics. The Soviet Union fell because of ideology. Each explanation is partially true. None of them is the whole story, because running underneath every one of those surface explanations, invisible to the historians who were too close to the events, visible only in retrospect, is the same psychological pattern we have been tracking throughout this video. The pattern doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't care about geography or military technology or economic systems. It operates the same way in a Roman toga as it does in a modern suit. Political scientists have a term for the moment when an empire transitions from expansion to contraction. They call it the imperial overstretch. The concept was developed by historian Paul Kennedy in his landmark 1987 study, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Kennedy's argument was elegant and disturbing in equal measure. Every great power in history has eventually committed the same strategic error. It expands its military and political commitments faster than its economic base can sustain them. It fights too many wars in too many places. It maintains too many bases, too many alliances, too many obligations. And then, at some point, the gap between what the empire has committed to defending and what it can actually afford to defend becomes too wide to bridge. The empire doesn't collapse overnight. It enters a long, slow decline that its own leadership consistently fails to recognize, because recognizing it would require admitting something that hubris syndrome makes psychologically impossible, that the empire has peaked. But here is what Kennedy's framework misses, and what political psychology adds. Imperial overstretch is not just an economic phenomenon, it is a psychological one. The reason empires overstretch is not simply that their leaders miscalculate costs and benefits. It is that their leaders, deep in the later stages of hubris syndrome, have lost the capacity to accurately assess costs and benefits at all. The same prefrontal cortex degradation that makes a leader dismiss their advisors, that makes them believe their judgment is uniquely correct, also makes them incapable of accurately reading the gap between imperial commitment and imperial capacity. They see what they want to see. They hear what confirms what they already believe. And they commit the empire, its treasury, its military, its credibility, to objectives that a clear-eyed assessment would have identified as unsustainable. Let me give you the case study that makes this most concrete. Vietnam, 1965 to 1975. By 1967, 2 years into the major American military commitment, virtually every serious strategic analyst outside the administration had concluded that the war was unwinnable as currently prosecuted. The Pentagon Papers, the classified internal study that was leaked in 1971, showed that the Defense Department itself had reached similar conclusions internally as early as 1966. The war continued for 8 more years. Why? The standard explanation is political. No president wanted to be the one who lost Vietnam. That is true as far as it goes. But political psychology takes us further. Each escalation, each commitment of additional troops, each bombing campaign, each expanded operation, was not just a strategic decision. It was a face-saving response to the public humiliation of the previous failure. Each failure demanded a response that would restore credibility. Each response created a new commitment. Each new commitment created a new opportunity for failure. And each failure demanded another response. It was not a strategy. It was a hubris syndrome feedback loop operating at civilizational scale. Escalation long past the rational exit point, driven entirely by the impossibility of being seen to lose. The British Empire after Suez showed the same pattern, but with one crucial difference. Britain found its exit. After the humiliation of 1956, after being forced to withdraw by American pressure, Britain went through what historians call the East of Suez withdrawal, a systematic reduction of military commitments across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East over the following decade. It was painful. It was humiliating in its own way. The public acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a global military power of the first order, but it was rational, and it was survivable. The difference between Britain's managed decline and America's Vietnam escalation was not intelligence or resources. It was the presence or absence of leadership capable of accepting public humiliation and adjusting accordingly. Harold Macmillan, who succeeded Eden after Suez, famously described his governing philosophy as events. Dear boy, events. His willingness to be moved by reality rather than pride is what allowed Britain to decline without catastrophe. Now, I want to be very precise here, because this is the point where sterling intel most risks being misread. We are not saying that any specific current empire is in decline. We are not making a political argument about any specific nation or leader. What we are saying, based on the historical record, the political psychology literature, and the framework we have built across this entire video, is this: when the markers of hubris syndrome are present in a leadership, when imperial overstretch is visible in the gap between commitments and capacity, when public humiliations have occurred and been met with escalation rather than adjustment, when the refractory period has collapsed and the audience costs of backing down are at their highest. The historical pattern is unambiguous about what comes next, not necessarily catastrophe. But the conditions for catastrophe are present, and the window for rational course correction is closing. Every empire believed it was different. None of them were. The question is never whether the pattern applies. The question is always whether anyone in the room has the clarity to see it and the courage to say it out loud before the window closes. That's chapter 9. There is a scene that plays out in every political crisis, every war, every diplomatic standoff, every moment where the gap between what is rational and what actually happens becomes most dangerous. All eyes turn to the leader, not to advise, not to counsel, not to offer an exit, but to watch, to judge, to record, to broadcast, to amplify, to demand. And in that moment, the leader is no longer making a strategic decision. They are giving a performance. And the audience, whether they know it or not, has become the most powerful force in the room. Political scientists have spent decades studying what they call the audience effect, the measurable, documented, peer-reviewed phenomenon whereby the presence of an observing audience systematically changes the decisions that leaders make. The research is unambiguous and deeply uncomfortable. Leaders make worse decisions, more aggressive, more rigid, less adaptive, when they believe they are being watched than when they believe they are not. A 2011 study by political scientists Jessica Weeks at the University of Wisconsin found that leaders who face high domestic audience costs, meaning leaders whose publics are actively watching and will punish retreat, are significantly more likely to escalate international disputes than leaders who face low audience costs. Not because escalation is the better strategy, but because the audience makes de-escalation psychologically and politically impossible. The audience doesn't just observe the crisis. The audience becomes a structural component of the crisis itself. Let me make this concrete with a concept from Japanese organizational culture: tatemai and honne. Tatemai, the face you present to the world, the public position, the official stance, what you say when the cameras are rolling and the audience is watching. Honne, your true feelings, your real assessment, what you actually believe when nobody is watching, and the pressure of performance has been removed. Every experienced diplomat knows that the most important conversations in international relations happen in the gaps between tatemai and hon. In the back channels, the unofficial meetings, the phone calls that aren't recorded, the conversations that happen after the press conference when the cameras have gone home. Because in those spaces, in the absence of the audience, rational actors can actually be rational. They can say what they actually think, acknowledge what they actually know, and explore solutions that the performance of tatemai makes publicly impossible. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was resolved not in the Security Council chamber where both sides performed their tatemai for the world. It was resolved in back-channel communications between Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, far from the audience, far from the cameras, far from the impossible demands of public honor. 13 days of public posturing. One private conversation that saved the world. Now here is the problem that the modern information environment has created. The back channel is disappearing. In 1962, Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin could meet privately because private actually meant private. No smartphones, no social media, no intelligence agency leaks appearing on Twitter within hours, no opposition politicians demanding to know what was being discussed, no allied governments watching with suspicion. Today, the concept of a genuinely private diplomatic conversation between major powers is almost fictional. Every meeting is tracked, every participant is identified, every departure from official position is treated as a potential scandal by the opposition, a betrayal by hardliners, a weakness by rivals. The audience has colonized the back channel, and in doing so, it has eliminated the one space where the gap between tatemai and honne could safely close. A 2019 study published in the journal International Organization found that the rise of social media has measurably increased the audience costs of diplomatic compromise, making leaders less likely to make the concessions necessary for peaceful resolution of disputes. The researchers estimated that a one standard deviation increase in social media penetration in a country increases the probability of that country initiating a militarized dispute by approximately 18%. 18%, because the audience is watching. The domestic audience is only half the problem. The international audience compounds it. When a leader makes a concession, even a rational, strategically sound concession, they face not one audience but many. Their own domestic public, their opposition parties, their military and security establishment, their allies who are watching to assess their reliability, their rivals who are watching for weakness, and the neutral nations who are calculating which side of history to be on. Each of these audiences applies different pressure, each has different expectations, each will interpret the same concession differently, and the leader must perform for all of them simultaneously, with no back channel, no private space, no room for the honest admission that tatemai prevents. The German political theorist Carl Schmitt wrote in 1932, before the age of mass media, let alone social media, that politics is fundamentally the distinction between friend and enemy. What he could not have anticipated is how the modern audience effect would make that distinction impossible to soften, because softening it publicly looks like weakness, and weakness in front of a watching audience is politically fatal. There is a Swahili proverb that captures this dynamic with extraordinary precision. Mgeni, siku mbili, siku ya tatu, empe e jembe. A guest for 2 days. On the third day, give them a hoe to work with. The proverb describes the moment when hospitality, the public performance of generosity and welcome, must give way to the private reality of what is actually sustainable. The guest who has overstayed must begin to contribute. But this transition from tatemai to hon, from performance to reality, can only happen when the relationship has matured enough to withstand honesty. In geopolitics, that transition almost never happens publicly, because the audience will not permit it. The moment a leader says publicly, "We overstated our position, we need to adjust," the audience interprets it as defeat. The opposition brands it as weakness. The rivals file it as an invitation. So leaders stay in the performance, long past the point where the hun, the true assessment, says it is time to pick up the hoe. The audience effect is not new. Leaders have always performed for audiences. Emperors had courts, kings had parliaments, generals had troops whose morale depended on the performance of confidence. What is new is the scale, the speed, the permanence. Every performance is now recorded. Every concession is searchable forever. Every moment of tatemai is archived and will be weaponized the moment the hone contradicts it. We have built a world where leaders cannot afford to be honest in public, and then we wonder why they seem so disconnected from reality. They are not disconnected from reality. They are trapped in a performance that the audience demands and that the architecture of modern information makes inescapable. And in that trap, with hubris syndrome already degrading their judgment, with the refractory period already collapsed, with the markets already feeling what hasn't been admitted yet, the conditions for catastrophic miscalculation have never been more perfectly assembled. That's chapter 10. So, here we are. We have traveled a long way together in this video, from a kitchen argument to a nuclear standoff, from a brain scan to an empire's collapse, from the amygdala of a single human being to the geopolitical calculations of the most powerful nations on Earth. And if the framework we have built is correct, if the science holds, if the history confirms it, if the pattern is as consistent as the evidence suggests, then we arrive at a question that is not theoretical at all. What do you do with this? What does an informed, clear-eyed person do with the knowledge that the world is being shaped by forces that are older than strategy, older than ideology, older than the nation-state itself? The first thing you do is change how you read the news. Most people read the news as a sequence of events. This happened, then that happened, then someone said this, then someone did that. The story is always about the surface, the press release, the statement, the announced policy, the official explanation. What you now know is that the surface is almost never the whole story. Beneath every escalation is an audience cost calculation. Beneath every aggressive statement is a hubris syndrome marker, or a face-saving response to a prior humiliation. Beneath every market move is an emotional reality that the official narrative hasn't caught up with yet. The framework we have built is a lens, and once you have it, you cannot unsee what it reveals. When you see a leader making a decision that seems incomprehensible, ask not what the strategic rationale is. Ask what the humiliation was. Ask who the audience is. Ask how long this leader has held power, and what stage of hubris syndrome their behavior suggests. You will find that the incomprehensible becomes predictable. Not comfortable, but predictable. The second thing you do is watch the markets differently. You now know that financial markets are not just economic instruments. They are the most honest emotional seismograph we have access to. They feel the psychological reality of geopolitical situations before the official narrative admits it. This gives you a specific set of signals to watch. When a dominant power faces public humiliation, watch the VIX, watch the currency of the humiliated nation, watch defense sector stocks, watch gold and other safe haven assets, watch bond yields in the affected region. These signals will tell you, before any press conference, before any official statement, whether the market believes the situation is moving toward escalation or de-escalation. The Portuguese have a word for this kind of knowledge, desenrascanço, the ability to improvise a solution using whatever is available, to navigate complexity without a map by reading the signals that others miss. Financial literacy, real financial literacy, not stock tips, is desenrascanço for the modern world. It is the ability to navigate geopolitical complexity by reading the signals that the official narrative is designed to obscure. The third thing you do is recalibrate your expectations of leadership. Not downward necessarily, but honestly. The framework we have built does not say that all leaders are corrupt or incompetent or malicious. It says that all leaders are human, and that the specific conditions of holding power, the isolation, the deference, the public performance, the audience costs, the hubris syndrome progression, create structural pressures that make good judgment systematically harder over time. This means the question to ask of any leader is not are they good or bad. The question is, what structures exist around them that might slow the hubris syndrome progression? What genuine checks on their judgment remain? Who in their circle is still able to say no and still be heard? A leader surrounded by yes rooms and insulated from consequence is dangerous regardless of their initial character. A leader with functioning checks, genuine opposition, independent judiciary, free press with real access, is safer regardless of their personal flaws. The institution matters more than the individual. It always has. The fourth thing, and perhaps the most important, is to understand your own audience effect, because everything we have described about leaders operates at smaller scale in every human life. The amygdala hijack happens in your kitchen. The hubris syndrome markers appear in your workplace. The audience effect shapes your behavior every time you make a decision in front of people whose judgment you care about. The Greek philosopher Epictetus, writing in the 1st century AD, a former slave who became one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, made an observation that is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. The audience that destroys rational judgment is not always external. Sometimes the most dangerous audience is the one inside your own head. The imagined judgment of others that shapes your decisions, even when no one is actually watching. Understanding the audience effect at the geopolitical level begins with understanding it at the personal level. And the personal level is where you actually have agency. You cannot fix the hubris syndrome of a sitting head of state. You cannot slow the speed of shame in the modern information environment. You cannot eliminate audience costs from the calculations of nuclear-armed powers. But you can be the most informed person in the room. You can read the signals others miss. You can understand why the incomprehensible is actually predictable. You can make better decisions, personal, financial, professional, because you understand the forces that are shaping the world you are navigating. That is not nothing. In a world where most people are passengers, carried along by events they don't understand, surprised by outcomes that were entirely predictable. Being the person who understands the mechanism is a significant advantage. That's chapter 11. Before we close, here's a necessary question. Has it ever gone right? Has there ever been a leader facing public humiliation, facing impossible audience costs, deep in the conditions that produce catastrophic miscalculation, who chose differently? Who absorbed the humiliation? Who accepted the audience cost? Who stepped back from the edge when every structural pressure was pushing them toward it? Yes. And the cases matter, because they tell us something important. Not that the pattern can be broken easily, but that it can be broken, and what it takes to break it. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. John F. Kennedy had been publicly humiliated at the Bay of Pigs invasion 16 months earlier. The CIA's operation to overthrow Castro had failed catastrophically and visibly. Kennedy had been in office for less than 3 months. The watching world, and more importantly, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, had seen the new American president fail his first major test. The audience cost of that humiliation was enormous. The pressure to respond, to prove strength, to restore credibility, to show Khrushchev and the world that America would not be pushed around, was not just political, it was psychological. It was the full weight of the Sekimen moment, pressing on a young leader already insecure in his authority. When Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba 16 months later, Kennedy's Joint Chiefs unanimously recommended airstrikes, followed by a ground invasion. The hawkish pressure from every corner of his administration was overwhelming. The audience, the American public, Congress, the military, America's allies, expected strength, demanded it. Kennedy chose the naval blockade instead. He chose the option that bought time. That kept the back channel open. That allowed Khrushchev to find an exit that didn't require public humiliation on either side. He absorbed the private criticism of being seen as weak by his own generals. He accepted the audience cost among hawks who wanted more aggressive action. He prioritized the rational outcome over the performative one. 13 days later, the world still existed. 1990. Nelson Mandela walks out of Victor Verster prison after 27 years. 27 years of imprisonment, the most extended public humiliation that can be inflicted on a human being by a state. His name erased, his voice silenced, his freedom taken. The audience expected rage. The logic of the situation demanded it. By every psychological framework we have examined in this video, the conditions for a Sekimen response of maximum intensity were present. The humiliation was total. The audience was global. The opportunity for revenge was real. Mandela chose reconciliation instead. Not because he was without anger. He has said himself that he felt rage. But because he understood, with a clarity that 27 years of forced reflection had produced, that acting on the rage would destroy the outcome he had spent his life working toward. The Japanese concept of gaman, enduring with patience and dignity what cannot be changed, is perhaps the closest cultural equivalent to what Mandela demonstrated. Not passive acceptance, active, chosen, disciplined restraint in service of a longer horizon. 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev watches the Soviet Union dissolve. The largest empire on Earth, the superpower that had defined the second half of the 20th century, collapsing in real time. His life's work, his country, his identity, his historical legacy, all of it unraveling publicly, visibly, irreversibly. He had the military, he had the nuclear codes, he had advisors urging him to use both. The audience of Soviet hardliners demanded action. The logic of empire demanded that he fight for what was being lost. He stepped aside. The Soviet Union ended without a Third World War, without a nuclear exchange, without the catastrophic escalation that every historical precedent suggested was coming. 3 cases, 3 leaders, 3 moments where the pattern that had produced Nero's Rome and Napoleon's Russia and Wilhelm's War was interrupted. Not by the absence of pressure. The pressure was overwhelming in each case, but by something rarer and more valuable than strategic genius. The willingness to absorb humiliation in service of a better outcome. What did Kennedy, Mandela, and Gorbachev share that their less fortunate counterparts did not? 3 things, and they are worth naming precisely. First, each had experienced significant personal suffering before their moment of decision. Kennedy's wartime near-death experience, Mandela's 27 years, Gorbachev's childhood in the shadow of Stalinist purges that killed members of his own family. Suffering, when it doesn't destroy, can interrupt the hubris syndrome progression by restoring contact with the reality that power tends to obscure. Second, each retained at least one genuine truth teller in their circle, someone who could say what the audience could not hear and what the leader needed to. Robert Kennedy for JFK, Walter Sisulu for Mandela, Eduard Shevardnadze for Gorbachev. Third, each had a longer time horizon than the immediate audience demanded. They were playing a different game than the one the crowd was watching, and they were willing to lose the performance in order to win the outcome. These are not qualities that systems reliably produce, but they are qualities that, when present, change everything. That's chapter 12. We started this video in a kitchen. 2 people, an argument, a slammed door, nothing that would make the news. Nothing that would move markets, nothing that historians would ever record or analysts would ever study. Just 2 human beings, both intelligent, both capable of reason, arriving somewhere neither of them planned to go, saying things they didn't mean, doing things they couldn't fully explain afterward. We have spent this entire video showing you that what happens in that kitchen is the same thing that happens in the Security Council, in the presidential palace, at the nuclear negotiating table. The amygdala doesn't know the difference. The shame-rage response doesn't check your rank or your title or your security clearance before it fires. The audience effect operates on a head of state and a husband at a dinner party through exactly the same mechanism. Same software, different scale, catastrophically different consequences. The most unsettling thing that behavioral science tells us about world leaders is not that they are different from us. It is that they are not. The same emotions that make an argument in a kitchen spiral out of control, the wounded pride, the audience pressure, the impossibility of being seen to back down, these are the same emotions that have started wars, collapsed empires, shaped the world you were born into, and the world your children will inherit. Understanding that doesn't make you helpless. It makes you the most clear-eyed person in the room. The mirror we won't look into is not out there somewhere, in some distant palace or war room or negotiating table. It is here. In the moment, you feel your face go hot because someone challenged you in front of people who mattered. In the moment, you doubled down on something you knew was wrong because backing down felt worse than being right. In the moment, the audience in your own head, the imagined judgment of others, made you a worse version of yourself than you would have been alone. That is secumen. That is emballement. That is the amygdala firing in a kitchen that happens to have nuclear codes in it. So the next time you watch the news, the next time you see a leader making a decision that seems incomprehensible, the next time the world seems to be moving towards something that no rational person could possibly want, remember the kitchen. Remember that the engine running the whole show, the engine that has always run the whole show, is not a supercomputer. It is the same engine that runs the argument, the same engine that has been running since before we had language to describe it. The same engine that Kennedy managed to quiet for 13 days in October 1962. That Mandela refused to start for 27 years. That Gorbachev chose not to floor when every instinct said floor it. Emballement, fear, shame, ego. The desperate human need to not be seen as weak. And right now, that engine is running very, very hot. This has been Sterling Intel. I'm Arthur Sterling. If this changed how you see the world, share it with someone who needs to see it too. Subscribe, because there is much more to come. And go down to the comments right now and tell me, which leader alive today shows the most advanced markers of what we discussed in this video? I won't answer that question, but I want to know what you think.